Good evening, everyone. Coming to you live from the Santa Fe Rail Yard. This is Scott Harrison, Artistic Director of Ironweed Productions, and I want to welcome you to Talking Theater Live. For those of you joining us for the first time, Talking Theater Live is a series of conversations between me and Santa Fe theater artists, sharing stories about their experiences in the theater and the unique paths that led them to creating theater in Santa Fe. Hi, Karina. She's jumped over to check. Scott Cooper, hello. So we got people jumping on here. This is awesome. Again, this is very exciting. We're in the rail yard. We're going to talk about immersive theater, and we're actually kind of doing an immersive interview. So this is awesome. I'm here today. I'm very honored to be here today with Nandita Dinesh, Santa Fe actor, writer, director, teacher, producer, and activist. Nandita, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And welcome.
Yeah.
Nandita holds a PhD in drama from the University of Cape Town in South Africa and a Master of Arts in Performance Studies from the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. She focused on the role that theater can play during and after violent conflict. Nandita has conducted community-based theater projects in Kashmir, India, Mexico, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Rwanda, Uganda, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. More about her work can be found at theaterinjustice.org and chroniclesfromkashmir.org. So, Nandita, I always like to start off my interviews with the question, because it always yields just a really interesting answer. When was the first time, what's your first memory of being captured by the imagination or the world of make-believe as a young person?
So my earliest memory, I think, was I grew up in this town called Coimbatore in southern India, and my mom enrolled me in Indian classical dance lessons from the time I was 3.5. So I think I've been on stage as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
But the memory that comes to mind is, I feel so bad for my mother, but I had this really bad habit of getting on stage, getting intense case of stage fright, and bawling my eyes out right on stage. And it would get worse when my mother was watching, so my poor mother had to hide behind the stage, and then maybe I would stop crying and continue performing, you know. So when you ask that question, that's the immediate memory that comes to mind.
So it was your mom that caused the anxiety, like when she didn't see her, you did
It was strange. It was really strange.
Yeah.
When she moved away, I would perform, and then when she came again, I would start crying. I don't know what it was about.
Interesting.
Of course, that's completely changed now, and now when I see her in the audience, it's the
like,
complete opposite,
yeah.
right?
Wow.
It's just like comfort.
Nice.
But yeah, that's one of the first memories that comes to mind.
That's great. That's great. That's great. That's funny, because I remember I have a distinct, just talking about, you know, the comfort of seeing your parents in the audience. I have a really distinct memory when I was in grad school. I was doing this outdoor Shakespeare play, and it was a lot of talk. Love's Labor's Lost. A lot of talking to the audience, and my dad and my stepmother had come to visit that weekend to see the play, and I just have this distinct memory of looking out in the audience, and like I saw my dad, like I caught his eyes, and I was just talking to my dad, and it was just, and it was, you know, you're outside. It was really just one of those, you know, magical. I mean, the same thing. I didn't get nervous. I was just
so glad to share it.
Yeah,
with them, right?
Yeah, it's nice. So along along that line, because a lot of the work that you do is about you know, having an impact, you know, and how can you most have an impact. Is there a memory that you have of watching live performance as a young person, that kind of where you first remember how impactful live performance could be just on you?
You mean as a performer?
As a person watching?
Oh, there've been so many. I think for me, though, more than a particular play that impacted me because of content, it was always the context that I found most powerful. So I think the performances that most made an impact on me were performances that I saw in my first exploration of theater and war, which was in northern Uganda in like 2005. and the notion of seeing theater being performed in an internally displaced person's camp, for example, where you're surrounded by tents and you're surrounded by everything that you can imagine or not imagine about that setting. For me, when I think of the impact of live performance, it's that immediately comes to mind, because it was the context just shaped everything that I experienced in that piece. And being in that moment, in that camp, and saying, am I really watching theater performance right now? What is going on? I think that's something that I always carry with me.
It's amazing to me how theater and storytelling, I mean, it emerges everywhere. I mean, and the time when it's most a necessity is when, to me, it's just most compelling and moving. Your passion and much of your work, or most of your work, is in immersive theater. Talk a little bit. Talk about that. What is immersive theater?
Yeah, of course. So it's become the buzzword, right? As we were just discussing this whole notion of immersion, and I have to sort of offer this disclaimer that the term is heavily contested, because people rightly point out that every theatrical experience is immersive in its own way. So calling this particular kind of aesthetic immersive is kind of a misnomer, you know? But the way I use the term to describe the work is when the audience becomes an actor within the context of the play. So where they take on a character, so they're not themselves, and they're asked to step into the shoes of another person. So the easiest way to often explain that is through the refugee simulations that the Red Cross often runs in high schools, where students are asked to, for 24 hours or even longer durations, go through a simulation of what refugees go through when they have to go through different places. So that it would be the closest to capturing what I mean. So it's always the idea of, how do you give someone who doesn't have X experience, the experience of X, but all the while trying to ensure that you're not promoting this unethical voyeurism, right? So how do you do it in a way that's careful, that's respectful, and that's not appropriative? And that often ends up being a trial and error type of thing.
Right. And when was there a time for you that you were do you remember what kind of initially drew you to that form of doing theater?
You know, there was this one article that I read by this scholar called Susan Hedica, and it was about a piece that was done in the European Union, which placed European citizens in the shoes of asylum seekers and asked them to live through the bureaucracy of passing through an immigration line or waiting for your papers to come through. And it was the idea of, how do you give the more privileged in this context an idea of other perspectives that live here. And I think for me, until that point, I loved the theater, but there was something, I didn't know what my aesthetic was. Nothing really had spoken to me in that way. It was always like, well, okay, I'll do it on a stage because that's what everyone tells me should be done. And suddenly I read this and a light bulb went off, you know? And I think I just got really lucky, because that was around the time I started working with this amazing theater company in Kashmir. And it's very rare to find a theater company that's willing to try an aesthetic that they've never tried before. And fortunately for me, they said, okay, I think we understand, where you're coming from. Let's try it. And that was hugely beneficial. And I think so much of my own thinking about the form has evolved because of them, and the ways in which we experimented with it. Because until that point, I don't think I knew what I meant.
Right. Theater. But so you had a chance with them to kind of find your footing with what you wanted to do. Because I know your Chronicles from Kashmir, that was a 24-hour experience, right? So when did you get the idea to kind of, I want to do something that's going to last a full day? I mean, had you worked on several things before then, or is And anyway, how did that? What was the progression to kind of? I want to do a 24-hour experience with an audience.
So we started. I used to go to Kashmir every summer. It first began as my doctoral project, and we had these smallish performances that we would create every summer. Always some aspect of immersion, but also trying to address different perspectives from Kashmir. But this sort of shift happened, I think, in 2016. When I went to Kashmir for my usual summer project, and a young man who was I'm trying to think of the right diplomatic term to use, so I'm going to give you all the terms that I used to describe him. Some describe him as a revolutionary hero, some describe him as a terrorist, some describe him as a militant commander, so it depends on where you fall on the spectrum.
Yeah.
But this young man was killed while I was in Kashmir. And then everything shut down, and our project essentially had to be cancelled. And there was, curfew and strike, and I was sitting in the theater company's premises with 2 or 3 of my colleagues who had come before all of these strikes had been imposed, the curfews had been imposed, and we were just sitting around talking, and we tried to work and we couldn't work because it was there was this boredom, a very heavy boredom, right?
Yeah.
Sort of this banality that we couldn't get through. And it was then that we were sitting around, and I was talking to a colleague saying, a lot of privileged people like me don't know what this feels like. How do we create a theatrical experience that might enable them to know what it feels like?
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, what if we just sat them in curfew for like 12 hours of the play? What would happen?
Wow.
And again, the artist who I was working with said, let's try it. Let's see what happens,
Right.
And again, not a response I expected. So it just came because in that particular moment, that's what we were doing, was just sort of sitting in closed rooms and.
Right. So you wanted to, give people the experience of this is what it's,
part of what it's like, right? So that's where, and it came up as a whim, really. I didn't expect anyone to say yes. And then because we couldn't work, I had all this time to sit down and write.
Yeah.
So I ended up sitting and writing it,
Oh gosh. And in the I'm fascinated by a piece that lasts 24 hours. Because I love cycles, cycles of plays, where you go and you might see, it might be 2 intermissions, three act, where you have dinner and all that. Just that feeling of, being, pardon the, immersed in a story for that period of time. But for a 24-hour show, what was it like balancing that thing of, okay, here, we have to have some points where the audience is actively engaged, and then there's other points where they're observing, or they're experiencing, or they're sitting, or was that a tricky balance to find?
Absolutely. And I don't know if we ever got it exactly right, because every audience is different. So we consulted I was doing a lot of reading about adult learning pedagogies and about cognitive neuroscience and how does the brain process information, and in what intervals is it best to do things, and it was fascinating rabbit hole to go down. But like most things in theater, you don't really know till you try it. So we tried it for the first time in 2017, and I think already we noticed that there were things that we needed to tweak. So when the script came out a year later, it's already a little bit different than what we actually implemented in 2017. Just because it's hard to get that calibration right. And then when you're talking about a 24-hour immersion, there's also these unpredictable things like the weather. So when we did it, it was monsoon season in India, right? And so we never accounted for how the rain was going to impact a piece that happens in the promenade that takes the audience from one space to another. And some of the scenes happen outdoors. And then you have this torrential downpour. And we're like, well, we didn't script that, so now what do we do? right?
Yeah,
So these
yeah.
qualities that came out that we didn't expect, and
Yeah.
I think had we had the opportunity to do more live performances of it, we could have come closer and closer to what the balance might have looked like. But as you know, we didn't really get the chance
Yeah,
to do
yeah,
that.
yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I know a lot of your work is geared toward is the impact that theater can have within the context of trauma, and violent conflict. Is there as a performer? Are there times that, and as you can tell, we're on the rail yard. The train's going by, so we'll let it go by here. There we go. Are there times as a performer, whether it's within the individual audience member or a group or the entire audience, where you can really feel a shift in terms of maybe some sort of trauma that they were carrying, and so, do you know what I mean? Some sort of shift within the people experiencing it, and what's that like? Or is it possible to describe?
It's hard to. It's hard to, just because there's been the whole range, right? So there's been the range of the very sort of predictable kumbaya type of, oh my god, this is so amazing and you have changed my life kind of experience. And then my immediate question is, well, this is in the moment. I'm not really sure how this affects life after. And then there's been very explosive negative responses, which have then transformed into positive ones later. So audience members who have been like vociferous critics of the work coming back the next day to say, actually, let me talk to you about what went wrong, and this moment of not necessarily catharsis in the notion of trauma, but like a cathartic moment of engagement between two people who just disagree with each other, right? So I've had both ends of the spectrum, and I think the question, Scott, for me is always, how does it extend beyond the theater, right? And that's where my work, I think, is still floundering a little bit, or is still challenged, is how do you talk about these big ideas and then have audiences leave feeling like that there's something that they can hold on to that could be channeled into agency. And I think when we have done this work about Kashmir, more often than not, we erred on the side of overwhelming them with emotion and intensity, to the point of them feeling helpless and saying, well, if it's all so messed up, there's nothing I can do about it, right? So I wouldn't say that there have been those emblematic moments, as you describe, of trauma being released, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
Right.
It's just a question of figuring out how to engage with whatever is happening.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you do any kind of are there ways in which you kind of follow up with people sometimes after the shows, you know what I mean, to kind of see, well, how this resonated with them? Or
and sometimes they respond, and a lot of the times they don't.
They don't. Yeah.
So for the Chronicles piece, especially after the 24-hour versions, I kept writing to people, I think once a month, once in 2 months, to check in, and like most other performances, the responses sort of dissipated after a while. But it's interesting because one of the things I've been thinking about, so aside from my work making theater, I tend to do a lot of research and writing about immersive theater. And so one of the things I've been trying to articulate is, what does it look like to train actors and spectators for immersive theater? That maybe when you're looking at this, and when I say immersive theater, I mean in this kind of social justice context, where you are looking to have some kind of long-term impact, however intangible, maybe we need to reconsider what it means to be a spectator to the theater, and that maybe even to be a spectator, you need to go through some kind of education or training, in which case post-performance is part of that framework.
Right,
you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so again, it's easy to dream up these frameworks when you're writing, and then implementing them in the real world is a different story.
Right. Well, I really like that. The idea of engaging the audience. I mean, I've always loved with theater spaces the feeling of any time that you can bring the performance out into the audience, whether it's having actors emerge, from the audience, or just that feeling where the audience doesn't feel quote unquote safe, or in that way of like, oh, I'm just here to watch this thing happening, as opposed to, oh, something's happening around me, like what am I don't know, that idea of really having the audience actively engaged is really cool.
And you've done some immersive theater, right, with Ironweed?
Yeah, we did a project just across the way at 2nd Street, and it was really we learned a lot. It was interesting because there were elements where, because it happened in a restaurant and people were all in it, certain things were like, how do we get things, do we have to make sure that everything's heard, or do we have where you're in a restaurant and suddenly you hear an argument bubbling up and maybe everyone doesn't hear it or see it in the same way, and it was the same kind of thing. I felt we had some really good feedback from people about things that didn't work with it, but it was the same. To me, it is like what you were describing. We went to 2nd Street with this idea. We said, we want to have these 9 interwoven kind of plays and monologues seamlessly going on in your restaurant on a Monday night. And they were like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And we learned a ton. And as you said, it's like you don't learn, there's no way to learn but just to jump in. And because we were really nervous the opening night. We're like, what? We just don't know what the experience is going to be like for people. You do the best you can to kind of simulate it.
Yeah.
So yeah, but it's a very invigorating. For that experience for me was very. The juices were, the creative, and you were buzzing from anxiety and from being thrilled and all that.
Absolutely.
Together.
No, I remember we were. After 24 hours of one performance, we were all just so jazzed, and we would end and be like, oh, we're ready to go again. Well, that lasted 2 hours till we all went and crashed. But this is amazing energy that comes about.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think the audience energy, too, that you get is very unique. And obviously for what you all do, incredibly unique for the amount of time that you're spending and that you're actively engaging people in it, in the experience. That just what we were talking about just made me think of a question that I've had. It's interesting. I find that as a performer, I can always tell, like, it's kind of like my litmus test. The more in the moment I am in terms of a particular play where I really feel like I was just in the moment, for as much time as it's kind of possible in a play. Always after those type of performances, I'm spacey. It's like your research on the brain. It just feels like my brain has gone to another
plane.
Yeah. It's just interesting because I can always tell, I was, that performance, I must have really been more in the moment than the one the night before because I'm just a total space cadet now. I can't, my thought process just don't work the same for kind of a certain period after the show.
No, and what's an interesting thing to think about is with Chronicles, the actors had such a personal connection with the content, right? So they had a lived experience of everything we were showing. So it was very much, it's me, but not me.
Right.
And so what I'm really fascinated about is also when you have actors with the lived experience engaged in immersive theater versus actors who don't, and how do they get affected differently, right? So if I was to take on the same narratives that they do, it would be very different because I would be playing a role. And I would channel parts of myself, but it would be still a character.
Right.
Whereas for them, it's them.
Oh, yeah.
And there were certain parts of the play that because they were 12 hours long, a particular segment, we even said, keep the characters as close to your real lives as possible, because in the moment if someone asks you something, you don't have to try to remember who you are. You're you.
You're just, yeah.
And so that's an interesting thing for me. I wonder what happens with immersive theater differently when you're playing a character.
As opposed to when you're yourself.
And you have that lived experience, right?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. That's fascinating. You know, it makes me think too. One of the other I was taught for several years with Impact, which is now Resolve, and it's a nonprofit in Santa Fe. They started more geared toward violence prevention, you know, and it was geared initially toward women, you know, violence prevention of women, and given women and children, and then ultimately now it's, you know, everyone just simple skills, verbal and physical, to defend yourself, whether it's a verbal assault, whether it's an actual physical assault. And it was fascinating for me because just in terms of the things we're talking about, because the role of the we call them the suits. The women in the scenario are alongside the students, coaching them through these, you know, the intense scenarios where you're trying to put someone in as realistic scenarios as possible of being assaulted or attacked or verbally abused or whatever. And then the suits, the men dress in these big padded suits with these big, you know, in these big helmets, and we play these characters and engage in these assaultive behaviors. But the interesting dynamic about it is that you're an actor in a certain sense because you're playing a role, but you're playing it actually with someone who potentially has dealt with trauma and around this kind of scenario. And you're also at the same time you're looking at, like, well, how can I teach them in this moment? You know, like, are they, you know, what do they need in this scenario to better empower them, and that type of thing. And anyway, the work that you do, I think, is just so inspiring because I think it just challenges actors and audiences in a different way. Whereas audiences, you have to really show up. You know, you have to.
Yeah, and so much of it is in their hands, you know, because if you don't want to engage, and if you don't want to, you know, so with this extended time where you're living in curfew, in the simulated curfew, you could easily decide to space out and pull out a book and just disconnect from the atmosphere, and then you're fine in a way, you know. And so it's really up to you. How deep are you willing to go? How deep can you go while also taking care of yourself? And so the audience having to think about their own limits of what it means to be empathetic, of what it means to be a witness, of what it means to be an ally. These are all questions that we hope will implicitly come up just in them having to decide, okay, I've had enough, I'm going to go now. What does that say about you as an ally? And I don't mean it as a qualitative judgment. I just mean, what does it tell you about yourself and how much you're willing to try to put yourself in someone else's shoes? You know?
Yeah.
So it's a scary world in some ways.
Right. And now, when you finish, so you finish one of these, you know, Chronicles of Kashmir, 24-hour piece. How do you? What's your process for kind of, taking care of yourself after finishing that? You know, I mean, in terms of what you've experienced as an actor, as a person, and just kind of coming off of an experience like that.
You know, I think for me, Scott, sometimes I go into the, oh my God, this was hard, and it, you know, the depression that comes after a performance, right? The grief of loss in some way, that's very much present. But I think for me, for better or for worse, the perspective comes from thinking, I'm not actually living this, and I get the privilege of choosing to make theater about this. And so for me, when I go into these modes of self-indulgence and you know, feeling distraught and worried about myself, is to then think about my colleagues. And that always puts it in perspective, and is to say that, you know, that's what they're living, and they have the courage and the resilience to come and share their stories, and still want to perform. And I think as soon as I think that, it's easy for me to put some of that weight aside, and the self-care just sort of emerges. I think that's been huge for me, is always reminding myself that I have such a big choice in all this, a choice that many of my partners don't have.
Yeah. You know, I've thought about another that kind of question of you know, because as a white male and a person of privilege, I mean, I find myself reflecting on as a person and as an artistic director, you know, what can I do to continually be trying to create more connection and more compassion and more empathy in my little corner of the world, you know, and how do you, and I feel, you know, sometimes that's about, I feel like that's about being active and doing something active, sometimes it's about listening, and then sometimes it's, you know, it's about just being a silent witness to someone else, allowing someone else to be and experience, and sometimes it's a tricky balance to negotiate in terms of what path to take. You know, I mean, I know that Ta-Nehisi Coates. I remember one of the things he wrote in his, I think it's Between the World and Me, which is a beautiful book. He talks about being a conscious citizen, which is, for me, that really resonated with me. You know, just being, trying to be conscious of whether it's the person you're interacting with across the table from you, or whether it's, you know, things that are going on the other side of the planet, or. But do you have? I mean, it's a tricky sometimes things to balance in terms of how do I make a difference in my little corner.
It's a very complex experience, right? Because I don't think I, for example, became aware of the color of my skin until I moved to the United States, and that was college, you know, many years ago. Yeah. And I think it was because I grew up in a very sheltered part of upper middle class India, which was pretty homogenous. We interacted with people, you know, who looked like us, so on and so forth. And so when I moved here, and suddenly being the oppressed required a huge shift in my own view of the world, because I'd never seen myself that way. And yet when you're in this country and you constantly hear the narratives of race and racism, it's hard not to see yourself as I mean, I am part of the oppressed minority, as it were. But I say this because when I work in Kashmir, what I represent is the oppressor. And so it's just been a very complex process of trying to balance that shift of, in some context, seeing myself in some way as being victim, and yet in other contexts seeing that I represent the perpetrator. And what does that mean for who I am, and how do I negotiate those spaces carefully and ethically, right? And not that I've figured out any great answer to it. It just depends on the situation, and it depends on who you're with and what's needed in the moment. But I think that's been really interesting for me, is this shift of feeling less than in some contexts, and then going to others where I know I have so much more. And so that shift of privilege has been really interesting. Yeah.
Well, I think, I mean, I always feel like it's just, I don't know, the constant, you know, questioning or self-reflection, or, I mean, that's, you know, in some senses, that's kind of the best you can, to kind of keep questioning and examining. And anyway, that's really interesting. Do you, in terms of the work that you do, and you've as a person, as a student, and as a theater person, you've been to so many different places around the world. I was curious, are there things about Santa Fe, the people, that are unique to, you know, to your experiences, and in a good way or a bad way? I mean, or you know, in just whatever way.
I mean, I think every place is unique in its own right. I think what makes this place unique for me at this point in time is that I'm different, and I'm at a place in my life where I'm looking to make a home base somewhere, and it happens to be now, and it happens to be here. Whereas I think all of my other travels, I wasn't quite ready to make that leap. So Santa Fe to me is unique because this is the place where I came to that sort of epiphany about myself, that maybe this is somewhere where I could stay still for a little while and try to build work here. And the other thing that's been super interesting is when I was first living in the US, it was in the Northeast, and at that time my narrative to myself was, I can never live here, I can never live in a place where I'm so conscious of the color of my skin. And then I left and I moved back to India for a long time. And then when my husband and I decided to move back to the States, he said, well, come and see New Mexico, see what it feels like. Because I've never been here before. And I don't know if, again, it could be that I'm different. But, being here, there's something, and I apologize if this sounds like an overgeneralization, but there's something about New Mexico that reminds me of home, and by home I mean India. And the only way I've been to articulate it is that the notion of time seems to be approached very similarly in both places. So one of the first days I got here, someone said to me, and they, I think, meant it as an insult, but they said, this is the land of mañana, right? And for me it was like, oh, thank God. Because that rhythm, I get. That rhythm of going with the flow of there is hopefully a tomorrow, and so let's cherish relationships and let's cherish people. That's how I interpret it. There was a certain similarity to home. That said, I will say that I know that this is a very complex part of the US, and I have only scratched the surface of the various degrees of inequality that exist in New Mexico. And so I'm also here trying to figure out how to be a more ethical guest, because I still see myself as a guest. And so how do I be a better guest when I live here?
I know what you mean. Yeah. Well, I always like to finish it off with this question as well, which always also never fails to yield a really interesting answer. What, if you could kind of boil it down to kind of one experience that you can remember as with the work that you do, is there one kind of experience where when you have it, or when you had it, you feel like this is why I have to do this? Do you know what I mean?
I feel like I have one of those moments every day. I just like I have a moment every day where I'm like, why the hell am I doing this? As well, right? So I feel like with this work, often I wake up in the morning and I'm like, what's the point? The world's still falling apart. What is theater really going to do in all of this chaos? And often something happens over the course of the day that says, okay, this is why I'm doing it. And sometimes it's even the simple stuff. It's my friends from Kashmir texting me to say, hey, what's going on? And that's enough to say, okay, that happened because of the theater. Right? So there's, and I think most of it is found in those small moments. But I think the closest feeling I've had to something epic is after the 24-hour performance. And I think there was, I don't even know how to call what I was feeling, but there was this thing where there was this belief that this is what I'm supposed to be doing. With this intensity, I don't even know how to describe it, but it was very real and very there.
That's great. Well, Nandita, thank you so much. This has been so fascinating and thought-provoking, and I've really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Me too.
And thank you all for joining us here on the Rail Yard. Again, this is Talking Theater Live, and we will be posting this on our Ironweed Facebook page. And Theater Santa Fe is also kind enough to post this on their community tab. We've got a little Talking Theater Live link on their community tab, so you can also watch the video there and also keep up on what we have coming up. Thank you again very much, Nandita. Thank you so much again, and good night, everyone.